On a muggy morning in the small town of Rosewood, Georgia, Officer Bill Hargrove adjusted his badge as he stared at his reflection in the police station's restroom mirror. To him, the badge wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a constant reminder of his self-appointed mission, to maintain what he called order. In his mind, that order meant ensuring people like him, white, conservative, and born and raised in Rosewood, kept control over the public spaces they believed belonged to them. Hargrove's worldview was built on a foundation of resentment. He blamed the struggles of small-town America on progress he didn't understand or accept. To him, the rise of civil rights and social change had ruined the way things used to be. He considered black people a threat, not because they had done anything wrong, but simply because they existed in spaces he didn't think they belonged. Hargrove had grown up hearing nostalgic stories about the segregation era, and often thought about how those good old days had disappeared. A few miles away, federal Judge Eleanor Washington was preparing for another day in court. Born in Atlanta, Eleanor had clawed her way from a childhood marked by poverty and systemic racism to become one of the youngest and most respected federal judges in the state. Her dark skin, sharp features, and confident demeanor made her impossible to overlook, and Eleanor carried herself with a dignity forged in the fires of constant struggle. She dressed impeccably in a navy blue suit, her sharp mind already focused on a pivotal case involving police brutality. Yet, even with her stellar career, Eleanor was painfully aware that her identity as a black woman often overshadowed her accomplishments in the eyes of others. In courtrooms, people regularly mistook her for a secretary or even a defendant, a stark reminder that even power and prestige couldn't shield her from the racism embedded in society. That morning, Eleanor felt a sense of unease she couldn't explain. She dismissed it, attributing the feeling to the weight of the day's upcoming responsibilities. But the streets of downtown Rosewood had plans of their own. At a broken traffic light near the town's main intersection, Eleanor's sleek black sedan came to a halt. The vehicle was a testament to her success, but to Hargrove, who was parked nearby in his squad car, it was an affront. When his eyes locked onto the car and then to its driver, his face twisted into a scowl. "Who does she think she is?" he muttered under his breath as he grabbed his ticket pad and stepped out of the cruiser. To Hargrove, this wasn't just a routine stop. The sight of a black woman in a luxury car stirred all his deeply ingrained prejudices. The confident way Eleanor held herself in the driver's seat only added to his irritation. He didn't see a professional woman or a judge. He saw a challenge to his worldview. The interaction began with a brusque demand. "License and registration," Hargrove barked, not bothering to explain why he had stopped her. His tone carried the weight of unearned authority, dripping with condescension. Eleanor, calm and composed, handed over her documents. "Officer, is there a problem?" she asked evenly. "Is this your car?" he shot back, ignoring her question and glancing skeptically at the registration. "Or did you borrow it?" Eleanor felt the familiar sting of his insinuation but kept her composure. "Yes, officer, it's my car," she replied. "I'm a federal judge on my way to court. If there's an issue, I'd like to resolve it quickly." Hargrove paused for a moment, narrowing his eyes. "A federal judge, huh?" he sneered. "And I'm the President of the United States." The situation escalated rapidly. Despite the validity of her documents, Hargrove accused her of resisting when she calmly questioned the reason for the stop. His voice grew louder and his demeanor more aggressive. Eleanor, refusing to be intimidated, stood her ground, but Hargrove saw her confidence as defiance. Within minutes, he had her out of the car and in handcuffs, accusing her of disorderly conduct. As he tightened the cuffs around her wrists, the sharp edge of his tone contrasted with Eleanor's quiet strength. "You people always think you're above the law," he muttered under his breath. Eleanor didn't respond. Instead, she glanced at the small crowd that had begun to gather, their smartphones raised as they recorded the incident. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about exposing a system that allowed officers like Hargrove to act with impunity. What Hargrove didn't realize was that Eleanor's identity as a federal judge was about to transform this routine stop into a national reckoning. The videos captured by bystanders would spread across social media like wildfire, turning a quiet town into ground zero for a larger conversation about race, power, and justice in America. Rosewood, Georgia, was a town caught between two identities. Its downtown area was a picture of quaint charm, with brick storefronts, family-owned diners, and a clock tower that hadn't worked in decades. But beneath the surface, the town bore the scars of its history, a history steeped in racial division. Confederate monuments dotted the courthouse lawn, a reminder of the deep-rooted values many of its residents clung to. Rosewood wasn't just a place, it was an echo chamber, where the past whispered constantly into the ears of the present. Officer Bill Hargrove was the product of this environment. Born and raised in Rosewood, he'd never left the state, let alone the county. He didn't see himself as racist. He saw himself as a realist. To him, the world was divided into people who respected the rules and people who didn't. And in his mind, it was clear who fell into each category. His upbringing had shaped him to view black people as outsiders, no matter how long they'd lived in the community. Hargrove's career in law enforcement was unremarkable, save for the number of complaints filed against him by black residents. Excessive force, unjustified stops, and condescending language were among the accusations. None of them stuck. Rosewood's leadership saw Hargrove as one of their own, a dependable man enforcing the town's unwritten rules as much as the written ones. Eleanor Washington, on the other hand, was everything Hargrove wasn't. Her rise to prominence was a testament to resilience and excellence. Growing up in Atlanta's Old Fourth Ward, she was raised by her grandmother, a retired schoolteacher, who instilled in her the importance of education and dignity. Despite attending underfunded schools and facing systemic barriers at every turn, Eleanor excelled academically. She earned scholarships to prestigious universities, eventually graduating from Howard Law School with honors. Eleanor's career was marked by a fierce commitment to justice, particularly for marginalized communities. She had overseen cases that brought national attention, from housing discrimination to voting rights violations. Yet, she never lost sight of her roots. Her decisions on the bench were as much about interpreting the law as they were about understanding the human lives it affected. Despite her success, Eleanor carried the weight of being a symbol. For many, she was proof of progress. For others, she was a threat. She knew her presence in spaces traditionally dominated by white men was often met with quiet hostility. Even so, she refused to shrink. On the day of her arrest, Eleanor's calm demeanor masked a simmering frustration. She had endured countless indignities in her life, being followed in stores, questioned about her qualifications, and called out of her name. But this was different. This wasn't a microaggression she could brush off. Hargrove's actions were an overt display of the very system she fought to dismantle. As she sat handcuffed in the back of the police car, Eleanor observed the world outside. The crowd had grown, their phones still pointed at her. She could hear murmurs of disbelief. "Isn't that Judge Washington?" "She's a judge. Oh, that cop is done for." Inside the car, Eleanor took a deep breath. She could feel her heart pounding, but she wouldn't let Hargrove see her fear. Instead, she focused on the implications of the moment. This wasn't just about her dignity. It was about shining a light on the abuse of power that people like Hargrove had wielded for generations. Hargrove, meanwhile, was oblivious to the storm brewing around him. To him, this was a simple case of someone acting above their station. He believed he was doing his job, enforcing the law as he saw fit. He didn't notice the bystanders or the phones. His mind was already on the paperwork he'd have to file for her resisting arrest. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere shifted when Eleanor was brought in. A young officer, fresh out of training, recognized her immediately. "Wait," he stammered. "Isn't she—" "Move along," Hargrove snapped. But the murmurs had already started. News traveled fast in Rosewood, and by the time Eleanor was placed in a holding cell, her name was trending on social media. Across town, in a courtroom packed with attorneys and spectators, Eleanor's absence hadn't gone unnoticed. Her clerk, a sharp-eyed young man named Marcus, was pacing nervously. When a reporter whispered something into his ear, Marcus froze. "She was what?" he asked, his voice rising in disbelief. Within minutes, Marcus had assembled a team of lawyers and was on the phone with federal authorities. Eleanor's position as a federal judge meant her arrest was not just a local matter. It was a legal and political earthquake. As the story gained traction, reporters descended on Rosewood. Videos of the arrest went viral, sparking outrage and calls for accountability. Activists flooded the streets holding signs that read, "Justice for Eleanor," and Racism has no badge. The town's leadership, once confident in their ability to sweep incidents under the rug, suddenly found themselves in the national spotlight. Meanwhile, Hargrove began to sense he was in trouble. Calls from higher-ups in the department started pouring in, demanding explanations. His casual arrogance began to falter as he realized that Eleanor wasn't just another woman he could dismiss. She was a federal judge with connections and influence far beyond his comprehension. Eleanor, however, wasn't interested in revenge. As she sat in the holding cell, she reflected on her next steps. She knew the law was on her side, but this was bigger than her case. This was a moment to expose the broader injustices that people like Hargrove perpetuated every day. As the story of Eleanor's arrest continued to spread, the tension in Rosewood escalated. Local news vans lined the streets outside the police station, and the crowd of protesters swelled by the hour. The air was charged with chants of "No justice, no peace," and "Say her name, Eleanor Washington." The town, long content to ignore the undercurrent of racial tension in its midst, was now at the center of a national firestorm. Inside the station, Hargrove paced nervously. The smugness that had defined his actions earlier was rapidly dissolving. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from his superiors. Each time, the voice on the other end was more irate. "Do you have any idea who you arrested?" barked the deputy chief during one call. "She's a federal judge, Hargrove. Do you know what kind of legal hell you've unleashed on this department?" Hargrove tried to downplay the situation. "She was resisting, sir," he said, his voice tinged with defiance. "I was just following protocol." "Protocol?" the deputy chief snapped. "Protocol doesn't include arresting a sitting federal judge on bogus charges. Fix this now." Meanwhile, Eleanor remained composed in her holding cell, but her mind was racing. She understood the gravity of what had happened, not just to her, but to countless others who didn't have the privilege of a title or a platform to fight back. This was her chance to bring systemic racism and abuse of power into the spotlight. The legal team Marcus had assembled worked quickly. By mid-afternoon, a federal marshal arrived at the station with an order for Eleanor's immediate release. The young officer who had recognized her earlier was tasked with opening her cell. "I'm so sorry about this, Your Honor," he stammered, his face flushed with embarrassment. Eleanor gave him a polite nod. "You're just doing your job," she said. "I wish I could say the same for everyone else here." As she stepped out of the cell, the atmosphere in the station was tense. Officers avoided her gaze, their usual bravado replaced with uneasy silence. Hargrove, however, stood in the corner, glaring. "This isn't over," he muttered as she walked past him. Eleanor stopped and turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. "You're absolutely right, Officer Hargrove," she said. "This is just the beginning." Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers as Eleanor exited the station. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward her, and questions flew in rapid succession. She raised a hand to quiet the noise. "I appreciate the support," she began, her voice steady. "But this isn't about me. This is about every person who has ever been mistreated by those sworn to protect and serve. It's about accountability and justice. I'm just one person, but together we can demand change." Her words electrified the crowd. What had started as a local outrage was now a national movement. Social media exploded with hashtags like "Ours Justice for Eleanor" and "Ours End Racist Policing." Prominent civil rights leaders and politicians voiced their support, and major news networks picked up the story. As the days passed, the pressure on Rosewood's police department intensified. Internal investigations were launched, and Hargrove found himself at the center of them. His disciplinary record, once buried under a veneer of institutional protection, came to light. The numerous complaints against him painted a damning picture. Hargrove's arrogance quickly turned to desperation. He doubled down on his defense, claiming that Eleanor's arrest was justified and accusing her of playing the race card, but his excuses crumbled under the weight of evidence and public scrutiny. Eleanor, on the other hand, used her platform to highlight the broader issues at play. She held press conferences, participated in town hall meetings, and worked closely with advocacy groups to draft proposals for police reform. Her presence was a powerful reminder that change was possible, even in places like Rosewood. But the journey wasn't without challenges. Eleanor received threats, letters filled with hateful language, anonymous phone calls warning her to stay in her lane. Some members of the town rallied behind Hargrove, painting him as a victim of political correctness. One evening, as Eleanor prepared for a televised interview, Marcus handed her a note that had been delivered to her office. It read, "We know where you live." Marcus's face was pale with worry. "You should have extra security," he said. Eleanor nodded. "I'll be fine," she assured him. But deep down, she knew the fight she had taken on was far from safe. The conflict reached a boiling point when the mayor of Rosewood, under immense public pressure, announced a town hall to address the incident. Hargrove was ordered to attend, and so was Eleanor. The event drew national attention, with cameras broadcasting live as the two faced off in a packed auditorium. During the town hall, residents shared their stories of harassment and discrimination at the hands of the police. Each testimony was a dagger to the carefully crafted image of Rosewood as a peaceful, law-abiding town. Eleanor listened intently, her heart heavy with the weight of their pain. When it was her turn to speak, she addressed the room with the same poise she carried in the courtroom. "This isn't just about one officer," she said. "It's about a system that allows prejudice to thrive unchecked. We cannot move forward as a community if we continue to ignore the harm being done to our neighbors, our friends, our children." Hargrove, given a chance to defend himself, stumbled through his words. The audience, once hesitant to criticize their police force, now openly challenged him. The tide had turned, and Hargrove found himself increasingly isolated. As the fallout from the incident continued to grow, the complexities of Eleanor's life and the broader impact of the events in Rosewood began to unfold. What had started as a single act of racial profiling now rippled into countless lives, uncovering hidden stories, rekindling old tensions, and sparking new alliances. Eleanor found herself at the center of a national spotlight, but the constant attention came with a price. Her every move was scrutinized, her past unearthed by opponents eager to discredit her. Articles appeared, questioning her judgments on past cases, her affiliations with civil rights groups, and even her personal life. One particularly scathing piece accused her of being too radical to serve as a judge, suggesting her advocacy for justice made her unfit for the impartiality required of her role. Eleanor dismissed these attacks publicly, but privately, they wore on her. Her brother, a schoolteacher in Atlanta, called one evening, his voice thick with concern. "You're brave, Ellie. But this fight, it's dangerous. These people don't play fair. Are you sure it's worth it?" Eleanor paused before answering. "It's not about me," she said quietly. "It's about every little black girl growing up thinking she's less because people like Hargrove tell her she doesn't belong. If I don't fight, who will?" Hargrove, meanwhile, was facing pressure from all sides. His wife, Brenda, a school secretary, grew distant as the scandal deepened. She had supported Bill's career, believing he was a protector of their community. But now, as the complaints against him were publicized and his racist attitudes laid bare, she began to see a side of him she'd ignored for years. One night, during a particularly heated argument, she threw a stack of printed news articles on the table. "Is this who you are, Bill? Because I can't keep pretending I don't see it." Hargrove slammed his hand on the table. "They're making me out to be the bad guy." Brenda's voice cracked. "Maybe it's because you are." The argument left Hargrove shaken. His world, once so certain, was crumbling, and he didn't know how to stop it. The town of Rosewood, once a close-knit community, became deeply divided. The protesters outside the station grew in numbers, but so did the counter-protesters. Some locals defended Hargrove, claiming he was being unfairly targeted for simply doing his job. In the local diner, arguments broke out between friends and neighbors. Lines were drawn, with some insisting the town's police force was being vilified, and others pointing to years of unchecked discrimination. One afternoon, a black high school senior named Jamal gave an impassioned speech during a protest. "We've been quiet for too long," he shouted into the microphone, his voice shaking with emotion. "I've been stopped by the police just for walking home from practice. My little sister is afraid of the people who are supposed to protect her. This isn't about one cop. This is about a system that treats us like we don't matter." His words went viral, becoming a rallying cry for the movement. But Jamal's outspokenness also made him a target. One evening, he found graffiti sprayed on his family's home. "Go back where you came from." His mother cried as neighbors helped clean the hateful words from their walls, while Jamal vowed to keep fighting. Amid the turmoil, unexpected allies began to emerge. Reverend Charles McAllister, a white pastor who had stayed silent during past controversies, stepped forward to speak at a community meeting. "This isn't just a black issue," he said, his voice trembling with conviction. "This is a human issue. If we turn a blind eye to injustice, we are complicit in it." His words were met with applause from some and scorn from others, but they marked a turning point. More townspeople began to question their own biases and the systems they had long accepted. Meanwhile, a local journalist, Sofia Ramirez, started digging into the police department's history. What she found was damning: a pattern of complaints ignored, records altered, and whistleblowers silenced. Her exposé, published in a major newspaper, brought national attention to Rosewood's deeply entrenched problems. Eleanor's arrest became the catalyst for a federal investigation into the Rosewood Police Department. Agents arrived in the town, interviewing officers and residents alike. They uncovered evidence of systemic racism, including incriminating emails and reports of cover-ups involving multiple officers. Hargrove, once untouchable, now found himself isolated within his own department. Officers who had once laughed at his crude jokes about race now avoided him, fearful of being implicated. The investigation also revealed the bravery of officers like Maria Lopez, who had tried to report misconduct for years, but had been silenced by her superiors. "This isn't just about one bad apple," she told investigators. "It's the whole tree." Through it all, Eleanor remained steadfast. She refused to let fear or fatigue deter her from the work at hand. But she wasn't just focused on justice for herself. She was determined to use this moment to create lasting change. She worked with civil rights organizations to draft a proposal for nationwide police reform, including mandatory body cameras, independent oversight, and anti-bias training. "It's not enough to punish one officer," she said during a press conference. "We have to dismantle the systems that allow officers like Hargrove to exist in the first place." The tension in Rosewood reached its breaking point on a hot Friday evening during a town-wide rally. The main square was filled with hundreds of people, their voices blending into a cacophony of chants, conversations, and distant news crews reporting live. On one side, protesters held signs demanding justice and reform. On the other, counter-protesters waved flags and shouted slogans defending the police. The air was thick with hostility, the line between the two groups dangerously thin. Eleanor stood on the makeshift stage, her presence commanding attention. She looked out over the sea of faces, some filled with hope, others with contempt. In her hand was a file containing damning evidence uncovered by federal investigators, documents that would change the course of the night and potentially the town's future. She took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. "I want to thank everyone here tonight," she began, her voice steady. "Whether you are here to support change or to defend the status quo, you are part of this conversation. And it's a conversation we must have if we are to move forward as a community." The crowd quieted as her words hung in the air. She could feel the weight of their expectations. "But tonight," she continued, "I'm not just here to talk about my arrest. I'm here to share the truth." She held up the file. "This is the result of the federal investigation into the Rosewood Police Department. What it reveals is shocking, but it is not surprising to those who have lived it." Eleanor began to read aloud. "In the last 5 years, there have been 48 complaints of excessive force filed against this department. Of those, 42 involved black residents, and not a single one resulted in disciplinary action. Officers have falsified reports, tampered with evidence, and targeted residents based solely on their race. This isn't conjecture, it's fact." Her words sent a ripple through the crowd. On one side, protesters cheered. On the other, counter-protesters shouted accusations of bias and lies. But Eleanor wasn't finished. "These patterns are not isolated. They are systemic, and they are upheld by individuals who believe they are above accountability." She looked directly at Hargrove, who stood among his supporters, his face flushed with anger. "Officer Hargrove is not the only one responsible, but he is emblematic of a culture that values power over justice." The mention of his name caused an uproar. Hargrove, unable to contain himself, stormed toward the stage. "You don't know anything about me," he shouted. "I've done nothing wrong." Eleanor didn't flinch. "Your record speaks for itself, Officer Hargrove," she said calmly. "This isn't about you as a person. It's about the harm caused by your actions and the system that protects you." As the tension in the square mounted, a loud bang echoed through the air. For a moment, everyone froze, their eyes darting around in panic. It wasn't a gunshot, but the sound of a firework, a small act of defiance meant to distract and escalate. The distraction worked. Chaos erupted as the two groups clashed, shoving and yelling. Police officers in riot gear moved in, trying to separate the crowd, but the tension was too high. Amid the chaos, Eleanor refused to leave the stage. She called for calm, her voice cutting through the noise. "Stop this!" she shouted. "This is not how we achieve change." Her courage inspired others. Community leaders and activists stepped in, pulling people apart and urging them to disperse. Slowly, the square began to calm, though the atmosphere remained charged. As the rally disbanded, Eleanor returned to her car, flanked by Marcus and a small group of supporters. She was exhausted but resolute. Before she could leave, an elderly black man approached her. His name was Thomas, a lifelong resident of Rosewood and a retired pastor. He handed her an old leather-bound journal. "This belonged to my father," he said. "He was one of the few black men in Rosewood to own land during the segregation era. When he died, I found this in his things." Eleanor opened the journal and scanned its yellowed pages. What she read made her blood run cold. It contained detailed accounts of police violence in Rosewood dating back decades, with names, dates, and descriptions of incidents eerily similar to those happening today. Among the names was a familiar one, Hargrove. "It's his grandfather," Thomas said quietly. "That family has been in law enforcement here for generations. They've been doing this for as long as I can remember." The revelation was a turning point, not just for Eleanor, but for the entire movement. It proved that the issues in Rosewood were not new. They were part of a legacy passed down through generations. Eleanor took the journal to the federal investigators, who immediately expanded their inquiry. The evidence uncovered in the journal, combined with the investigation's findings, led to sweeping indictments against several officers, including Hargrove. As the legal system began to hold the department accountable, Rosewood found itself at a crossroads. The town's residents, once divided, began to come together to reckon with their history and rebuild their community. The revelations uncovered during the rally sent shockwaves through Rosewood and beyond. The journal, coupled with the federal investigation, became a national story, further amplifying the conversation about systemic racism and abuse of power in policing. For some in Rosewood, the weight of these truths was too much to bear. For others, it was the long-awaited vindication of struggles that had been ignored for generations. Eleanor Washington became a reluctant figurehead for the growing movement. Her story resonated with people across the country, and she found herself invited to speak at universities, community forums, and even congressional hearings. At a televised panel on racial justice, Eleanor spoke with her characteristic composure. "This isn't about vilifying individuals," she said, "but about dismantling systems that perpetuate harm. Officer Hargrove's actions were inexcusable, but they didn't occur in a vacuum. They were the product of a culture that tolerates and even rewards discrimination. If we want change, we have to address the root causes, not just the symptoms." Her words struck a chord, galvanizing people into action. Across the nation, protests turned into policy discussions, with activists pushing for police reform and racial equity. For Officer Bill Hargrove, the consequences were swift and severe. The investigation uncovered years of misconduct, including falsified arrest records and evidence of racial profiling. He was suspended without pay pending trial, and his name became synonymous with the kind of policing America was beginning to confront. Hargrove's fall from grace extended beyond his professional life. His wife, Brenda, filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. His children, once proud of their father's role in the community, distanced themselves, ashamed of his actions. During a tense deposition, Hargrove attempted to defend himself. "I was just doing my job," he insisted. The media twisted everything out of proportion, but his excuses held no weight. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his inability to take accountability only deepened the public's disdain. In Rosewood, the community faced an uncomfortable truth. Their town's history was built on a foundation of systemic racism, upheld by generations of silence and complicity. Town meetings became battlegrounds for heated debates about how to move forward. One of the most poignant moments came when Reverend Charles McAllister organized a reconciliation service at the local church. People from all sides of the conflict were invited to share their stories. Jamal, the high school senior who had spoken out during the protests, stood at the podium. "This isn't just about one bad cop," he said. "It's about the system that made people like him think they could get away with it. We have to change that. Starting here, starting now." His words were met with a standing ovation, signaling a shift in the town's collective mindset. Thomas's journal became a powerful symbol of Rosewood's past and its potential for transformation. The federal investigators used it as evidence in their case against the police department, but it also found a home in the town's newly established Civil Rights Museum, created to educate future generations about the importance of justice and equality. During the museum's opening ceremony, Eleanor was invited to speak. She stood in front of a crowd that included both old allies and former adversaries. "This journal represents more than just history," she said. "It represents the courage of those who spoke out, even when no one was listening. It's a reminder that we must never stop fighting for what's right, no matter how hard it may seem." The fallout from the investigation led to sweeping changes in Rosewood's police department. Officers implicated in misconduct were removed, and new leadership prioritized transparency and accountability. Community oversight boards were established, giving residents a voice in how their town was policed. Eleanor, though no longer directly involved, kept a close eye on Rosewood's progress. She often visited the town, meeting with activists and community leaders to ensure that the changes were not just superficial, but deeply rooted. As the dust began to settle in Rosewood, the town faced the daunting task of rebuilding itself, not just its systems, but its trust. The journey was neither smooth nor swift, but it marked a turning point that offered hope for a better future. For Eleanor Washington, the aftermath of her ordeal was both a test of resilience and an opportunity for reflection. The arrest and its consequences had thrust her into a position of immense influence, but it also came with challenges that tested her resolve. One evening, during a quiet dinner with Marcus, she confessed her lingering doubts. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it?" she asked, her voice unusually soft. "The sacrifices, the constant battle. Sometimes I feel like the progress is so slow that it's impossible to see." Marcus looked at her with unwavering conviction. "Eleanor, every step forward, no matter how small, matters. Look at the people you've inspired, the changes that are happening because you didn't back down. That's worth everything." Buoyed by his words, Eleanor doubled down on her efforts. She began working on a national initiative aimed at addressing systemic racism in the justice system, partnering with lawmakers, activists, and community leaders. Though the work was grueling, it was also deeply fulfilling. Bill Hargrove, once the embodiment of unchecked authority in Rosewood, found himself living in the shadow of his actions. Disgraced and unemployed, he spent his days in isolation, replaying the events that led to his downfall. At first, Hargrove clung to his belief that he was the victim of a witch hunt, but as time passed, the evidence of his complicity became impossible to ignore. One night, while sorting through boxes of his belongings, he came across a photograph of himself as a young officer, standing proudly with his father, who had also been in law enforcement. For the first time, Hargrove felt a pang of guilt, not just for his own actions, but for perpetuating the legacy of prejudice he had inherited. He realized that his father's teachings, which he once idolized, had blinded him to the humanity of the people he was supposed to serve. Seeking redemption, Hargrove wrote a public apology. In a letter published in the local paper, he acknowledged his role in upholding a racist system and expressed regret for the harm he had caused. "I cannot undo the past," he wrote, "but I am committed to learning from my mistakes and supporting efforts for change." The letter was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a step toward healing, while others dismissed it as too little, too late. But for Hargrove, it was the first step on a long road toward accountability. Rosewood itself became a symbol of transformation. The new police chief, Maria Lopez, implemented sweeping reforms, including mandatory anti-bias training and community policing initiatives. The department's newfound transparency earned cautious praise from residents, though many remained wary, determined to hold the force accountable. The town also took steps to confront its history. Schools incorporated lessons about local civil rights struggles into their curriculum, and public spaces once named after Confederate figures were renamed to honor activists and community leaders. Jamal, the high school senior whose voice had galvanized protests, emerged as a local leader. With the support of community members, he founded an organization dedicated to mentoring young people and advocating for racial justice. His passion and determination inspired a new generation of activists, proving that change could come from within. Eleanor's case became a touchstone for broader movements across the country. Police departments in other towns and cities began facing similar scrutiny, with citizens demanding transparency and accountability. Laws were passed at the state and federal levels, including measures to increase oversight of law enforcement and protect citizens' rights during interactions with police. Eleanor's work on the national initiative culminated in a landmark bill introduced in Congress. The proposed legislation sought to address systemic issues in policing, including the establishment of independent review boards and stricter guidelines for use of force. Though the bill faced significant opposition, Eleanor's testimony before Congress left an indelible mark. Standing in front of the committee, she spoke with a conviction that silenced even her harshest critics. "This isn't about politics," she said. "It's about people. People who deserve to live without fear, people who deserve to be treated with dignity, and people who deserve justice. We have the power to create a system that serves everyone equally. The question is, do we have the courage?" Months after the rally that had changed everything, Eleanor returned to Rosewood for a community celebration. The mood was markedly different from the tension-filled days of protests and clashes. The town square was now adorned with banners celebrating unity, and the once dilapidated clock tower had been restored, its hands finally moving forward. Eleanor took the stage once more, this time greeted with applause from a crowd that reflected the diversity of the town. In her speech, she acknowledged the progress made, while reminding everyone that the work was far from over. "Change is not a moment," she said. "It's a process. It's messy, it's difficult, and it requires all of us to stay committed. But Rosewood has shown the world that transformation is possible. If we can do it here, we can do it anywhere." As the crowd erupted into cheers, Eleanor felt a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in months. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, she believed it was one worth traveling. The months following Eleanor's return to Rosewood were a testament to the resilience and determination of the town and its people. Change was happening, incrementally, unevenly, but undeniably. Yet beneath the surface, tensions remained, and Eleanor knew that the journey toward justice was far from over. While many in Rosewood embraced the changes, a vocal minority resisted them fiercely. This group, composed of longtime residents and former police allies, saw the reforms as an attack on their way of life. They organized rallies under the banner of Preserve Our Heritage, decrying what they called overreach by federal authorities. Among them were allies of Bill Hargrove, who still viewed him as a scapegoat for a larger agenda. The group began circulating petitions to reinstate him and to halt the implementation of the police reforms. Though their numbers were small, their actions were disruptive, fueling discord within the community. Eleanor monitored these developments from afar, but she was far from idle. Her national advocacy work had brought her into contact with other communities experiencing similar struggles. She organized a coalition of activists, legal experts, and lawmakers to address these challenges head-on. Yet, her attention remained fixed on Rosewood, the place where her fight had started. The climax of Rosewood's reckoning came when the cases against Bill Hargrove and several other officers went to trial. The courtroom became a battleground for two conflicting narratives, one that sought to expose the systemic failures of the police force, and another that portrayed the accused as victims of a politically motivated witch hunt. Eleanor attended the proceedings as a spectator, sitting quietly in the back row. While she wasn't directly involved in the case, her presence was a powerful reminder of the stakes. The prosecution built a damning case, presenting a mountain of evidence that included falsified reports, video footage, and testimony from residents and whistleblowers within the police department. Among the most compelling witnesses was Maria Lopez, the newly appointed police chief. Taking the stand, she recounted her years of trying to report misconduct, her voice trembling with emotion. "I joined the force to serve this community," she said, "but what I found was a culture of fear and corruption. It's time for that to end." Hargrove's defense, by contrast, relied heavily on deflection and denial. His attorney argued that he had been following department protocols, and that the complaints against him were exaggerated. When Hargrove took the stand, he maintained his innocence, though cracks in his composure began to show. "I'm not a racist," he insisted, his voice rising. "I was just doing my job." But under cross-examination, the prosecution unraveled his claims, presenting evidence of discriminatory patterns in his arrests and exposing his use of dehumanizing language in internal communications. Outside the courthouse, the trial reignited activism in Rosewood. Protesters gathered daily, their chants echoing through the streets. Counter-protesters were also present, but their numbers dwindled as the weight of the evidence against Hargrove became undeniable. Jamal, the young activist, played a pivotal role in maintaining the momentum. He organized peaceful demonstrations and worked closely with local leaders to ensure the community's voices were heard. His efforts were instrumental in keeping the movement focused and unified. Eleanor, though not officially involved, offered guidance and support. She frequently met with Jamal and other activists, sharing her insights and helping them navigate the challenges of sustained advocacy. As the trial neared its conclusion, tensions in Rosewood reached a boiling point. One evening, a brick was thrown through the window of the Civil Rights Museum, shattering the glass display that housed Thomas's journal. The attack was seen as a direct threat to the progress the town had made. Eleanor was called immediately. She arrived at the museum to find a shaken Thomas standing amid the wreckage. "They're trying to scare us," he said, his voice trembling. "They're desperate," Eleanor replied firmly. "And they're losing." The incident galvanized the community. The next day, volunteers gathered to repair the damage, their determination stronger than ever. The journal, though slightly damaged, remained intact, a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity. The trial's closing arguments marked a pivotal moment for Rosewood and for Eleanor. The prosecution delivered a powerful summation, imploring the jury to hold Hargrove and his co-defendants accountable for their actions. "This case is not just about these officers," the lead prosecutor said. "It's about a system that allowed them to operate without fear of consequence. It's about the lives that were shattered, the trust that was broken, and the justice that demands to be served." As the jury deliberated, the town held its breath. The weight of the decision was palpable, not just for the defendants, but for the entire community. The jury's decision came on a crisp morning, just as the first hints of fall began to color the trees in Rosewood. The courthouse was packed, with residents, activists, and reporters filling every available seat. Outside, the streets were lined with people holding signs and chanting, their collective energy a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Eleanor sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, her presence commanding silent respect. Though she was not on trial, her journey had led to this moment, a confrontation not just with individuals, but with the system they represented. The jury filed into the room, their expressions somber. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman who had remained stoic throughout the trial, rose to speak. "In the case of the state versus Officer William Hargrove, we find the defendant guilty." The words reverberated through the courtroom, setting off a wave of reactions. Gasps, cheers, and cries of relief filled the air as supporters embraced and counter-protesters stood in stunned silence. Hargrove's face, once hardened with arrogance, crumpled under the weight of the verdict. His attorney placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but the gesture was futile. The evidence had been overwhelming, and the jury's decision reflected the community's demand for accountability. When the judge read out the sentence, a combination of prison time and a permanent ban from law enforcement, it was clear that Hargrove's career and reputation were irreparably destroyed. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate. Supporters of justice erupted into cheers, their chants of "Accountability now!" echoing across the square. Eleanor watched the scene unfold with a mix of relief and resolve. This was a victory, but she knew it was not the end of the fight. The system that had allowed officers like Hargrove to operate unchecked still required dismantling and rebuilding. As she left the courthouse, reporters swarmed her with questions. "Judge Washington, what does this verdict mean for Rosewood and for the country?" one asked. Eleanor paused, choosing her words carefully. "This verdict is a step toward justice," she said. "But it's only a step. The work continues not just here in Rosewood, but across the nation. Today we've held one man accountable. Tomorrow we must continue to hold systems accountable." Her response was met with applause from the crowd. The verdict marked a turning point for Rosewood. The police department underwent a complete overhaul, with officers implicated in misconduct removed and replaced, with those committed to transparency and fairness. The town established a civilian oversight board, ensuring that residents had a voice in shaping law enforcement policies. Jamal, the young activist, became a prominent figure in the town's transformation. Under his leadership, the mentorship program expanded, offering educational opportunities and leadership training to underserved youth. His passion and commitment inspired others to get involved, fostering a sense of unity that Rosewood hadn't seen in decades. The trial and its outcome had far-reaching consequences. Eleanor's story and the events in Rosewood sparked a national reckoning, prompting reforms in police departments across the country. Several states adopted laws aimed at increasing accountability, including mandatory body cameras, independent review boards, and stricter guidelines for the use of force. Eleanor became a leading voice in the movement, her speeches and writings shaping the discourse around racial justice and systemic reform. Yet, she remained grounded, never losing sight of the people and communities at the heart of the struggle. As the nation moved forward, Bill Hargrove faded into obscurity. Serving his sentence in a state prison, he spent his days reflecting on the choices that had led to his downfall. Letters from former supporters dwindled, and visits from his family stopped altogether. For the first time in his life, Hargrove was forced to confront the pain he had caused and the emptiness that came from a life defined by prejudice and power. In Rosewood, the Civil Rights Museum became a beacon of hope and education. The journal that had played a pivotal role in the town's transformation was restored and placed in a glass case with a plaque that read, "This journal represents courage, resilience, and the fight for justice. May it remind us of our history and inspire us to build a better future." During the museum's dedication ceremony, Eleanor was asked to speak. Standing before the crowd, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Rosewood's story is not unique," she said, "but what we've done here can serve as a model for others. We've shown that change is possible, that accountability is essential, and that progress requires courage. Let this museum be a reminder of where we've been, and a guide for where we're going." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a testament to the resilience of a community that had faced its darkest truths and emerged stronger. Months after the verdict, life in Rosewood had settled into a new rhythm. The reforms enacted in the wake of the trial were taking root, slowly but steadily reshaping the town's identity. While the scars of its past remained, the community had taken steps toward healing, and the sense of division that once defined Rosewood was giving way to cautious unity. Eleanor Washington continued her work as a federal judge, but her life had irrevocably changed. Her name was now synonymous with justice and resilience, and her influence extended far beyond the courtroom. Despite her elevated profile, Eleanor remained humble, focusing on the individuals whose lives her decisions impacted. One afternoon, she received a letter from Jamal, now a freshman at a prestigious university. He wrote to thank her for her guidance and inspiration. "You showed me what courage looks like," the letter read. "Because of you, I know that change is possible, even when it feels impossible." Eleanor smiled as she folded the letter. It was moments like this that reminded her why she had chosen this path, despite its challenges. Rosewood's transformation was ongoing, but its progress was undeniable. The new police force, under Chief Maria Lopez's leadership, was earning the trust of the community through transparency and genuine engagement. Community policing initiatives brought officers into neighborhoods not as enforcers, but as partners. The Civil Rights Museum became a hub for education and activism, drawing visitors from across the country. Its exhibits told the story of Rosewood's reckoning, ensuring that the lessons learned would not be forgotten. Jamal, now a leader in his own right, often returned to Rosewood to speak at the museum. His mentorship program had expanded statewide, and he was working to implement similar initiatives in other communities. "I owe everything to the people of this town," he said during one such visit. "We're proof that even the hardest fights are worth fighting." Bill Hargrove, once a fixture of Rosewood's law enforcement, had become a footnote in its history. After serving his sentence, he moved to a neighboring state seeking anonymity. His attempts to rebuild his life were met with limited success, as his name remained a symbol of the old ways Rosewood had worked so hard to leave behind. In private moments, Hargrove reflected on his past with regret. While he would never fully escape the consequences of his actions, he found solace in small acts of atonement, volunteering at a local shelter, and quietly donating to causes that supported racial justice. On the anniversary of the rally that had sparked Rosewood's transformation, the town held a celebration in the newly renovated town square. The event brought together residents, activists, and visitors, all eager to honor the progress made and recommit to the work ahead. Eleanor was invited to speak as the guest of honor. Standing beneath the restored clock tower, she looked out over the diverse crowd. "Today is a day to celebrate," she began, "but it's also a day to remember. Remember the struggles that brought us here, the voices that demanded change, and the courage it took to face our truths. Rosewood's story isn't finished, it's just beginning." As the crowd erupted in applause, Eleanor felt a profound sense of hope. The road to justice was long and arduous, but moments like this made the journey worthwhile. Years later, a young girl walked through the Civil Rights Museum with her mother. She stopped in front of the glass case that held Thomas's journal and read the inscription aloud. "Mom, who was Eleanor Washington?" she asked. Her mother smiled. "She was someone who stood up for what was right," she said. "Someone who showed us that even one person can make a difference." The girl stared at the journal, her eyes wide with wonder. "I want to be like her when I grow up." This story is a powerful reminder that justice isn't an abstract concept. It's a responsibility we all share. Eleanor Washington's journey shows that one voice, when combined with courage and resilience, can spark meaningful change. Her fight against systemic racism and abuse of power isn't just a story of one town. It's a call to action for every community. Now it's your turn. What part of Eleanor's journey resonated most with you? How can we take inspiration from her story to make a difference in our own lives? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Take a moment to like, comment, and share this story. Let's keep this important conversation alive and bring more people into the fight for equality and justice. Don't forget to follow us for more stories that inspire, challenge, and motivate action. Together, we can amplify voices that matter and build a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Eleanor's story doesn't end here, and neither does the fight for justice. Join us in being part of the change. Your engagement makes a difference.